Situation. Saxon forces are assembled in Hastings, England. Mission: secure the crown of England. Execution. On 14 October 1066, engage and destroy the Saxons. Administration. The Norman army will take the field and carry out the mission at all costs. Command and control under the leadership of William the Conqueror. Welcome to Conquerors. I'm Captain Dale Dye. 1066 is the most famous year in English history. It was the year that the Battle of Hastings was fought. Harold II, King of the Saxons, was defending his country against the ruthless Duke of Normandy, known as William the Bastard. The winner would be King of England, the richest country in Europe. William was a general, a politician, a visionary, and a bit of a medieval mobster. He made offers to friends and rivals that they couldn't refuse. William saw these people as pawns in his never-ending quest for riches, power, and most of all, respect. Only the conquest of England would finally silence his challengers, or so he thought. 14 October 1066, and William is fighting the most important battle of his life. In the midst of the fight for the crown of England, his soldiers start to flee from the solid Saxon shield wall. Then, William's horse falls beneath him, and a rumor quickly spreads. The Duke is dead! William immediately remounts, pushes back his conical helmet, and rides on in front of his men.
It is me, William. I live, and with God's help, I will conquer!
William's men turn, cheer, and charge back into the fray. The conquest of England is on. But how did William's quest for the crown of England begin? For most of his life, William was known as the Bastard. Although his father, Robert the Magnificent, was the Duke of Normandy, his mother was only a tanner's daughter and his father's mistress. Young William was scorned for his mother's status and plotted against by neighbor barons who wanted to claim Normandy for their own. When his father died in 1035 while returning from a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, young William was like a lamb among wolves. Robert's barons picked off William's supporters one by one, poisoning his guardian and stabbing his teacher. A young William even witnessed his personal servant having his throat slashed before his eyes in a failed kidnapping attempt. William would frequently be awakened in the dead of night and smuggled to another castle for safety. Somehow, William survived. At 15, he was knighted by King Henry I of France and joined him in battles against his enemies. It was in these years that the beleaguered boy learned the ways of the warrior, the tactics of a commander, and yearned to be a feared conqueror himself.
He was constantly in danger. He was in danger not only from the people who wanted to take over the duchy, but from people immediately around him. So his early life was sense of needing to establish himself was paramount in his early years. And it was that drove him to be such an incredibly energetic general.
At the age of 25, the wrath of William was reported for the first time.
William was besieging Domfront in 1051, and while he was at the siege, he decided on a night march to the town of Alençon to see if he could capture it. He got there in the morning to discover that the gates were shut and the defenders had put fresh hides over the battlements and were taunting William by hitting the hides and shouting, "Hides for the tanner's son."
Hides for the tanner's son!
You will regret this!
Raged, William led a vicious attack on the outpost and killed all who stood in his way. 32 prisoners were rounded up, their hands and feet chopped off, their eyes gouged out. Alençon quickly surrendered to William. His enemies learned not to make jokes about his mother.
By the time he then got back to Domfront, the message had got to them as well, and they made sure they very quickly surrendered before the same thing happened to them. It was a valuable lesson to William. It was the first time he'd done something of this severity, and it obviously went into his brain that if he used a short show of aggression, he would then get a much quicker result than a prolonged siege.
He was fighting all the time to retain his power within the duchy and to extend his power. And one of the important things that he had to do was to tame the baronage, the barons and the knights of Normandy, to make them obey him, in a sense, to acknowledge his leadership and his power. And he did that everywhere he could. And partly it was militarily, partly it was by family ties, partly it was by giving out land.
William
made Caen his capital in order to control the west part of Normandy, which rebelled against him when he became duke. To that end, he built a fort on the rock where the castle now stands. This fort will become the Ducal Castle.
It took years of warfare between his neighbors before William the Bastard had total control of his land. And then, William saw a chance to expand his territories beyond unified Normandy and across the sea.
England was one of the wealthiest countries in Europe. It was also one of the most stable countries in Europe, and it was the country perhaps that was best governed in Europe. It was a genuine prize if you could win England.
Edward the Confessor, the Saxon King of England, was a distant cousin to William and had spent much time with him in Normandy. William claimed that the crown of England had been promised to him to keep it from the hands of Edward's rival, Godwin of Wessex. However, Harold, son of Godwin, soon became the commander of King Edward's army and a trusted ally. Harold was a fierce warrior and had kept Edward's enemies at bay. In 1064, Harold mysteriously arrived on the north coast of France. Here, he was taken prisoner by Count Guy of Ponthieu. The reasons for his visit have been surrounded by mystery. However, the Normans were quick to help future generations understand Harold's motives and all the events leading up to the Norman conquest with a handmade piece of propaganda. The most famous document from William's time is the Bayeux Tapestry. It measures 1.5 feet high by 230 feet long. It's essentially an embroidered cartoon containing 58 scenes from William's life, all from the Norman perspective. It's a storyboard that illustrates exactly how William wanted to be remembered by history. The Bayeux Tapestry begins its version of events with Harold's arrival on the coast of France.
It's possible that Edward was sending Harold over to reinstate his offer to William of the crown of England, and this is certainly what the Normans later said. Unfortunately for Harold, he pitched up on the lands of an underling of William of Normandy, and he was in prison. And it was William who stepped in and paid off Harold's ransom, and so Harold was then handed over to William of Normandy, at which point he becomes an honoured guest, and evidently promises were made.
Harold repaid his debt to William by following him into battle against Brittany.
The Bayeux Tapestry depicts Harold saving 2 soldiers from the Duke's army from being drowned as they crossed the river Cunon, separating Normandy and Brittany. He apparently saved 2 soldiers at that point and fought very bravely during the battle.
Au cours de cette campagne, il aurait fait preuve d'une immense bravoure au combat.
Harold was able to demonstrate his mettle, and William was able to see what a fearsome warrior Harold was. But also, when they came back from Brittany, William suggested that Harold swear an oath to him, and this is the infamous oath of 1064.
At Bayeux Cathedral, William demanded a solemn oath of loyalty. It was an offer Harold couldn't refuse.
I think in the 11th century an oath was pretty serious. It was said that the oath was made on secret relics that were covered with a cloth, and it's said that the cloth was then whipped off and Harold's face is aghast at seeing these things he's had his hand over.
Harold's oath had been before God, and it was a promise that would have dire consequences in the years to come. Harold left Normandy and soon forgot about his alliance with William. He immediately started lining himself up for the throne. First, he exiled his younger brother Tostig.
You leave me no choice. Take him away. Insult me.
And then he gained the loyalty of the king's elite fighting force, known as the Huscarls. Then, on 5 January 1066, Edward the Confessor,
the Saxon King of England, died.
You had by his bedside the Archbishop of Canterbury, you had Harold by the bedside, and at one point it seems that Edward might have reached out and touched Harold's hand, and this was seen as making him effectively his successor.
This may have been a reward for defeating Edward's enemies in battle. With no royal blood in his veins, Harold feared rival claims to the throne. He wasted no time and made the governing council of England crown him as king. The stage was set for war. William felt cheated and betrayed, not just by Edward, but also by Harold, a man he considered a sworn ally. 2 years after his oath to William, and just 3 months after he was crowned king, long-haired star raced across the sky. Later it became known as Halley's Comet. It was seen as a bad omen for Harold and caused panic among his Anglo-Saxon people. To William, it was the divine signal he'd been looking for. Now was the time to strike. Now was the time to conquer England. On 6 January 1066, Harold Godwinson claimed the throne of England for himself, breaking his holy oath of loyalty to Duke William of Normandy.
When William received news that Harold had been crowned King of England, he was apparently setting out on a hunting expedition, and his response was to abandon the hunt, slink back to his palace, and sink into a sullen sulk. And he stayed silent for several hours. And then he came round, and one of his first actions was to summon a council of the great Norman nobles and outline his basic plans for an invasion of England.
In 1066, William was the most powerful man in the French kingdom, and he was fully aware of his power. He had the ability to gather more soldiers and build a bigger fleet than anyone in the region. Each Norman man was required to do 40 days of military service under William and provide their own weapons and armor. However, William was rich enough to recruit mercenaries and noblemen from other regions. They would be rewarded with a share of the lands and loot once the battle was won. At the port of Dives-sur-Mer, the Normans built about 700 ships, enough to carry 8,000 men and 3,000 war horses for William's invasion of England. However, building an alliance would not be so easy. The counts of northern Europe saw fighting the fearsome Harold on his home turf as a huge gamble.
William's next move was a stroke of genius. He went over Harold's head and appealed directly to the Pope, and managed to secure a papal blessing for his mission. It turned his invasion into a crusade.
The importance of this papal blessing cannot be overstated. Pope Alexander II was more than happy to send in William to destroy Harold's family, who had kicked out the lawful Archbishop of Canterbury. Now, the Vatican saw their chance to once again take control of the English Church.
Now the nobles who were against invasion could rally to his flag because they were going on a holy war. And it also psychologically made the Normans God's elect. So it made it very difficult for any other rulers in Europe to come to Harold's assistance.
The stage was set for war between the two most feared commanders in Europe. Both armies shared much of the same equipment and weapons. Each dressed in mail armor, carried wooden shields covered in leather, and sported conical helmets with nose guards. However, their main weaponry and tactics were from different schools of thought. The typical Anglo-Saxon of 1066 wore his hair long and sported a mustache. But these were no peace-loving hippies. They were more like the Hells Angels of Europe. Their weapons and tactics represented the old school of Scandinavian warfare.
Harold had a private body of warriors known as the Huscarls. While they normally rode to battle, they would dismount and fight on foot. They were extremely well disciplined and absolutely fearless. They were Harold's Marine Corps. The weapon of choice was a two-handed battle axe, a massive, powerful weapon with a 4-foot handle and a 12-inch steel blade. Now, this could be used in a number of ways. It could be used to immobilize a Norman shield, to hook that defensive shield out of the way and move in for a killing blow, or to reach in and hamstring the Norman so that the kill shot could be delivered when he was on the ground. The remainder of Harold's army was composed of the Fyrd, his reserve soldiers. 1 in 5 countrymen were called up to do battle. The remaining 4 provided a variety of weapons, and one of the most popular was this fighting spear. Had an 8-inch blade and these distinctive wings on either side of the blade, and that was the key to its effectiveness in combat. The spear could be used to hook a shield and get it out of the way so that a kill shot could be delivered directly into his torso. The spear could also be thrown at an effective distance of about 30 feet. Another projectile weapon used by the Fyrd was this 4-inch axe, one-handed axe, the same sort of tool that was used back on their farms. This could be thrown and effectively buried in the center chest of an opponent. There weren't many archers in the Saxon army, but there were a number of very good slingers. This biblical weapon, when used by a good slinger, could fire up to 6 small stones a minute. Now, that's not exactly a machine gun, but it can be deadly if one of these stones hits you in the head.
If Harold's Saxons were the Hell's Angels, then William's Normans were the skinheads. They shaved the backsides and top of their heads, leaving only a tuft of hair at the front. They'd be clean-shaven, which gave them a look more closely associated with the military of today.
The Normans had an edge on modern weapons and tactics. They rode mighty war horses, and that made the mounted Norman knight the tank of the 11th century battlefield. The horses were weapons in and of themselves. They were taught to stomp and crush anyone that resisted the charge. And the Normans possessed another piece of modern technology, the stirrup. The stirrup gave the cavalryman the opportunity to ride standing up. Thus he could put the whole weight of his body behind each stroke with the sword or each thrust with the 8-foot cavalry lance.
William also hired mercenaries from Brittany and Flanders who were skilled in short-bow archery, the slingshot, and even the crossbow, a weapon not yet used in England.
William believed in a combined arms approach to warfare. First, he'd soften up an enemy with barrages of arrows and stones and spears and bolts. And then he'd send in the mounted knights to mow down any remaining opposition.
In July 1066, Harold prepared his troops on the south coast of England. His army of 10,000 men waited and waited, but William never came. The Duke was waiting for the winds to change so his ships could reach England safely. The king then made a crucial decision. After waiting for William the whole summer, he let his men go back to their farms and harvest their crops. What he didn't know was that he would now be facing a war on 2 fronts. In early September 1066, Harold's exiled brother Tostig returned seeking vengeance. Together with the feared king of Norway, Harald Hardrada, he landed with thousands of Viking warriors intent on conquering England for himself. Harold scrambled to reform his army and marched north. Commencing 20 September, Harold and his men marched 190 miles in only 5 days. They immediately took care of the would-be conquerors. The Saxon speed took the Viking army by surprise.
It was an incredible victory. I mean, the fact that Harold was able to move his army all the way up from London to Stamford Bridge, surprise his enemies, win a very substantial military victory, was really quite an achievement. It's another indication of what a fine general Harold really was.
Days later, on 28 September, William and his army of 8,000 men landed at Pevensey Bay. They braved the autumn seas in an attempt to surprise Harold. This invasion between Normandy and England was the largest since the Romans 1,000 years earlier, and it would not be matched until D-Day, almost 900 years later. However, William's grand entrance did not go as planned.
William's landing at Pevensey Bay was almost a disaster. William stepped out of the boat onto the shingle and promptly fell flat on his face in the mud. And he looked round and he could see his men's expressions. This was a bad omen.
The superstitious soldiers would think, oh my God, now we're in for it. But one of the knights is supposed to have said to William, you've got the earth of England in your hands there. And then, of course, it was turned to his advantage.
William couldn't believe his luck. He was met with no opposition. His ships quickly unloaded their soldiers, horses, weapons, and supplies, and then they made camp at the site of an ancient Roman fort. Only days later, Harold heard that William had reached England. The king must have been distraught. He'd have to fight the battle of his life all over again. Harold quickly reformed what was left of his bloodied army and marched back down to London to defend the capital. He only stopped briefly to pray at Waltham Abbey, asking God's help to defend his kingdom. William's coalition force then targeted the south of England as their area of operations. They raped, burned, and killed all that opposed them in order to provoke Harold into meeting them in open warfare. At Hastings, William made camp knowing that an outright attack on the capital would be foolhardy. He sent spies to find out where the Saxon army was hiding. Meanwhile, Harold was back in London raising a new army when he heard of the devastation in the south. Against his advisors' wishes, Harold personally led 8,000 veterans another 100 miles south to a ridge outside of Hastings called Santlache. It would later be known as Senlac, meaning Blood Lake. Speed and surprise had won the day at Stamford Bridge. Maybe this tactic would work again. Harold lined his men up at the top of a slope, giving him a tactical advantage. He then ordered his Saxons to create a wall of shields along the ridge, blocking William's way to London.
Because the hill is actually shaped a bit like a hammer with the shaft running back towards the woods at the back. It seems to have been quite steep and choked with brushwood and bushes and such, and it was only the front which had a more gentle slope, which was actually available for the Normans to come up.
Would Harold's shield wall be able to withstand the Normans' combined weaponry? Would William risk his prized knights in an uphill frontal charge? With Harold's northern reinforcements marching to meet him, William had to strike now to win.
As dawn broke on Saturday, 14 October 1066, Duke William of Normandy led 8,000 soldiers to Black Horse Hill near Hastings, England. Here, his soldiers put on their armor. However, as William put on his hauberk, a coat of chain mail like this one, he put it on back to front. His soldiers gasped at such a bad omen. Thinking quickly, William reversed the hauberk and declared, "Today, I change from a duke to a king." William was not only a great general, he was a master of spin.
With the papal banner flapping in the wind, William told his men that this crusade could only end in victory or death. There was no escape plan. There would be no mercy from the axe-wielding Saxons. He then produced the sacred relics that Harold had sworn his infamous oath on to prove that God was on their side. The Normans marched to the bottom of a steep slope where they saw a Saxon shield wall 800 yards long blocking their way.
Harold's best line of defense was the mighty shield wall. His men stood shoulder to shoulder with their shields interlocked. It was strong enough to resist a barrage of enemy arrows, or it could resist attacks by enemy infantry. Now, if the Saxons were disciplined and held their ground, this wall was virtually unbreakable. Add to that spear points sticking through the gaps in the wall, and you had an obstacle that no Norman soldier was anxious to charge, particularly after running uphill in chain mail. The courage, the stamina of these men was incredible.
William positioned his soldiers in 3 divisions of men. The forces of Brittany were to his left. William and his Normans were in the center, and the French and Flemish were on his right flank. In each division, archers were in front. Then came infantry carrying swords and spears. His hit squads, the cavalry, were to the rear. Both flanks featured swamps and thick brush. William's only option would be a frontal assault uphill. The Saxon shield wall was less than 200 yards from his front line, and his target, King Harold, was only 300 yards away, protected by his private bodyguards, the Huscarls.
Harold must have been respected. I mean, he fought and won against Harold Hardrada, who was probably in England regarded with even more fear than William was.
I would say Harold probably up until 1066, as a campaign commander, probably did have the edge.
Et certainement sur le standard de l'époque.
William's army is one of the most efficient, one of the most dreaded. When he arrives in England in 1066, the Duke already has a long-standing military career, and he has never been defeated.
At 0900, the Battle of Hastings began, the sound of chanting soldiers and banging shields. William ordered his archers to let fly, but the Saxons at the top of the ridge simply deflected the rain of arrows and bolts with their shields. William then launched an attack with his foot soldiers. His heavily armored men ran up the slope, dodging stones, axes, and spears until they hit the solid shield wall. It didn't budge. The Saxon shields were held so tight to one another that not even the dead could fall. Saxon swords and spears jabbed through the shield wall at the Normans, whose dead were now rolling down the hill back toward their duke. William then ordered his prized knights to charge. Both sides had been waiting for this moment. It was the clash between the modern tactics of Europe and the old style of Scandinavian warfare.
It's interesting to surmise what must have been going through their minds, because they probably had never fought horsemen before. The tactics they used in the 11th century was more of the charge by a group of followers with their lord, and they might throw the lance, they might stab with it.
William's cavalry were exhausted from charging up the slope and dodging spears, and then they found themselves facing an impenetrable defense. Harold ordered his men to hold their shield wall tight and not advance, in the hopes that William's men would wear themselves out, run out of arrows, be easy pickings if any Saxon reinforcements arrived the next morning.
They were astonished by the variety of objects that were thrown at them from behind the shield wall by the Anglo-Saxons. Maces, axes, anything they could get their hands on were hurled at the Normans, and also their own comrades as well, because should a Norman actually get a toehold in the shield wall, he was simply pulled in, run through, and then his body thrown back to his comrades with the shout of "out, out."
At noon, after 3 exhausting hours of combat, the shield wall stood solid. Piles of men blocked the way of William's cavalry. The Bretons had had enough and started to retreat back down the hill. This dangerously exposed William's left flank, and that caused panic among the Normans, who immediately fled. Against Harold's strict orders, several hundred Saxons broke their line and charged down after their enemy in search of glory. Suddenly, a rumor spread. William had been slain. The Normans had witnessed his horse fall beneath them, and they began to sense that they too might be finished. William quickly found another horse, remounted, rode up, and pushed back his helmet to show his men that he was very much alive.
Men of Normandy, it is me, William. I live, and with God's help, I will conquer!
He then led a group of knights across the field to cut down the advancing Saxons. A small hillock became a killing ground, and it was a pivotal moment in the battle. William's crisis had passed, and now he saw a way to break through to Harold. According to chroniclers, William then organized several feigned flights, or fake retreats. His soldiers charged the Saxon line twice, and both times ran away. The overeager Saxons chased them, were surrounded, and slaughtered. Harold was furious. He'd now lost a third of his men and was losing control of the rest. By 1600, daylight was starting to fade. Once darkness fell, William would be at a complete disadvantage.
He had to win the day, and he literally launched everything he got at the English wall.
It's been suggested that William then changed his tactics. He ordered his archers to shoot high into the air beyond the shield wall. This caused panic in the Saxon ranks. Both of Harold's brothers fell dead from the falling arrows. It was a brilliant move by William. William's warriors charged again and were able to attack around the edges of the now shorter shield wall. they also broke through the middle toward King Harold. William sensed victory was close, but he needed to kill Harold before he could be king and claim to be Conqueror of England.
After almost 8 hours, the Battle of Hastings was reaching its climax. 3 horses had been killed under William, and a Saxon axe had dented his helmet. By 1600 hours, the Normans had broken through the Saxon shield wall. Norman archers fired over the heads of their own foot soldiers, deep into the Saxon ranks, causing chaos. But King Harold still lived. The conquest of England was not yet in William's grasp.
An arrow, seemingly from the heavens, descended and struck Harold in his right eye. Punishment maybe for breaking his holy oath. However, one story suggests he wasn't dead yet. Harold was staggering blindly, protected by his personal bodyguards.
William looked up onto the ridge and saw Harold up there. And of course he knew that Harold was alive, victory wasn't his. So he said, I want you effectively to lead a 4-man hit squad, and that's your target. I want Harold dead. There were about 20 Norman knights fighting with the household, so the 4 knights used the confusion to effectively get into them and then ran Harold through. Another of the knights chopped off his head, another knight disemboweled him, and the 4th knight cut off his leg. Now, cutting off his leg may well have been a euphemism for the fact that he actually castrated Harold.
Elements of Harold's furred men fled for the safety of the forest in the encroaching darkness. William then led 50 men after them and finished off the last efforts at resistance. Finally, late in the day, around 1800, William rode back to his camp. He was surveying the thousands of dead bodies as he passed, but there was one body he was particularly interested in.
They couldn't actually tell which one was Harold's body, and he was only recognized when his mistress came to the battlefield and identified him by personal marks on his body that were known only to her.
Possibly 20%, 30% of the Normans were killed or severely wounded, but we really don't have any idea. The casualty list amongst the English must have been pretty bad, because we know that William has plenty of lands to give away, because so many of them seem to have died at Hastings.
When William was victorious at the Battle of Hastings, he sat back and just waited for the submission of the rest of England, but it didn't come. So on October the 20th, the Norman army was on the march again.
And he then took a long circular route to get to London in order to harry the countryside, to make sure that people understood that the army was on the way, and to sow some confusion in his enemies.
William's army marched through the great cities of the south. Dover, Canterbury, and Winchester each submitted as William arrived. He then hacked and burnt a path north, destroying the villages and crops. Now, his armies threatened the capital.
William's strategy worked. London was now surrounded by a trail of devastation. Its leaders decided enough was enough. Eldred, the Archbishop of York, came out of London to meet with William and his army. There, Eldred begged him to accept the crown of England.
On Christmas Day, 1066, William was crowned King of England in Westminster Abbey. Great cheers inside the Abbey led knights outside to believe a revolt was taking place.
And their reaction is fascinating. They didn't rush into the Abbey to defend their king. They effectively went from the Abbey and started burning down the Saxon houses and killing Saxons around the Abbey. So here's the king who's waded through a river of blood to become King of England, and his coronation is marked by flames licking around Westminster Abbey as the crown's placed on his head.
William quickly replaced the English earls with his own Norman barons, payment for their services at the Battle of Hastings. England's new landlords spoke a different language, had different haircuts, customs, and new ideas in architecture and commerce. He also installed his bishops as the head of the country's church.
He didn't destroy the Anglo-Saxon government. He adopted all of the institutions and all of the territorial arrangements that the Anglo-Saxons had established, and then used it on his behalf and on behalf of his aristocracy to run the country and to extract wealth out of the country.
After William's victory in 1066, he brought various loyal Saxon noblemen back with him to Normandy. The people at the court of Caen were surprised at the way their former enemies looked.
Des nobles saxons.
They're compared to ladies because their hair hung down below the shoulders. This hairstyle will quickly become fashionable amongst the young people. Even the sons of William will follow the Saxon fashion and have long hair and a mustache. That will become the talk of the town. It was a way for the young to rebel against the adults. It was their way to off their parents.
Saxonne, des cheveux longs, de la barbe et de la moustache qui va faire beaucoup.
William immediately began a massive plan to build forts and abbeys which could control the Saxon population. A castle would be built every 15 miles, or the distance a horseman could ride in a single day. By the end of the 11th century, hundreds of wooden and stone castles studded the English landscape. An abbey was even built on the site of his conquest, just outside Hastings, in the town now known simply as Battle.
One of the first things that William did when he was offered the crown of England was send soldiers on ahead and on a mound outside to the eastern side of the city of London. He built, well, first of all, a wooden tower, but it was that tower that effectively then became the Tower of London that we know today. And then in virtually every town, these huge mounds, 80 feet high, were thrown up, castles put on top of them. These were centres of Norman administration. But more importantly, it was Norman architecture, and it was to say, yes, you've been conquered, but you've been conquered by God's elect. For look at these glorious churches. So it was establishing the fact that William's mission to conquer Anglo-Saxon England had been a mission from God.
This was one of the important things in holding the new kingdom. When William went to quell revolts, he put castles in towns as he went, and they're still there to this day.
However, by 1069, William was facing a rebellion in the north. In the city of Durham, 900 Normans were killed in a revolt led by English rebels. William once again put on his helmet and led a force north to quash the rebellion. During his march through the northern counties, William ordered the annihilation of everything in sight. Every man, woman, and child was butchered. Every village was set ablaze. All animals, livestock, farming equipment, all destroyed. His ravaging of the north was so complete that 10% of the English population was exterminated. Plague spread throughout the north. No one was even alive to bury the dead. The effects of William's tactics in Yorkshire lasted for 60 years. But soon, William's battles and buildings led him into financial trouble. William needed to find out exactly what resources he now had. The English feared for what little possessions they had left. The word spread from village to village. Doomsday was approaching. Here's William's tips for conquerors. Employ psychological operations, including propaganda. Muster powerful allies, the Pope, for instance. Stay focused and stay on the attack.
William had spent thousands defending his kingdom, building castles, and bribing his enemies. His conquest of England had also made his head the richest prize in Europe. It was time for a quick stock check. He ordered a survey of all of the assets in England that could be taxed to fund his forces. That survey became known as the Doomsday Book.
20 years after the conquest, royal commissioners were sent to all 13,418 settlements. They recorded who owned what before the conquest, after it, and now in the spring of 1086. It was said there was no single hide, nor a yard of land, nor indeed one ox, nor one cow, nor one pig, which was left out. It also grimly illustrated the extent of William's rampages and atrocities throughout the country.
The Doomsday Book speaks of depopulated villages and whole swathes of land which, before the harrying, had been fertile, were now completely laid waste. And it set the economy of the north back by a good 80 years. But from William's point of view, what it did was stamp out further resistance.
The survey was done with incredible speed. In only 6 months, the country's assets had all been accounted for. William used the information in the Doomsday Book to set new taxes and strengthen his financial position.
it is a hugely impressive document, and for historians it's something that you can't equal across the Channel. It's very unique to us and tells us a huge amount about what was going on in England at the time.
In his old age, William had a new problem to worry about: his weight.
The fact that he was so fat became a bit of a joke, and he was often teased about it. In fact, many people said that he looked laid in, which meant he looked pregnant. So William seems to have decided that he should do something about it, and was on the way to the equivalent of an 11th century health farm when he decided he'd exact a little bit of retribution for a French invasion.
In July 1087, William burned down the town of Mantes on the border of France. However, while riding through the fires, his horse violently stopped to dodge burning embers. William was thrown against the pommel of his saddle, which ruptured his intestines. This internal bleeding led to peritonitis. For the next 6 weeks, pus slowly filled up his intestines as he lay dying in agony. On his deathbed, William divided his kingdom among his sons. Robert was granted Normandy, and England was left to William Rufus.
It was reported that on his deathbed, William was quite remorseful about the conquest that he's undertaken and about his life of war. He looked back over his life, realized that he had been at war all his life, that he'd been fighting all his life, and that he had caused a great deal of bloodshed and misery.
The king is reported to have made a last confession, seemingly regretful of his conquest, saying, "May God forgive me, for I have taken that which was not mine. I am stained with the rivers of blood I have shed." On 9 September 1087, the great bell of Saint-Gervais tolled to mark the passing of King William I. He was 60 years old. Those in attendance grabbed all the gold, weapons, linens, furniture, and clothes and cleaned out his castle, leaving the once feared conqueror stripped, naked and alone. A single sympathetic knight took William's body to St. Etienne's church in Caen for a royal funeral. Due to his peritonitis, his body had bloated out of proportion. During the funeral, a small fire broke out. This caused panic in the church. Temperature rose, and that, combined with the king's pus-filled bowels, caused his body to explode when it was forced into a small stone sarcophagus. Pus flew everywhere and covered the walls.
Stench was so foul that we're told even the incense would not drown it out. And here's this great man who's ended his life naked on the floor. Now at his funeral, his corpse has exploded. There's a stench filling the air, and many of the mourners ran for the door, clasping their hands over their noses.
It was a dishonorable end for the most powerful man in Europe. Today, only this gravestone at the Church of St. Etienne in Caen marks the final resting place of this son of Normandy. According to a local legend, the remains of King Harold II, whom William killed at the Battle of Hastings, were brought to Waltham Abbey just outside of London. A small, lonely gravestone is all that reminds England of its last Saxon king.
When we look around us in England, the great stone castles, the great cathedrals, were all part of the Norman inheritance. And the language as well, of course. French words that came into the language, which are still in the language today.
I think William was a chancer who in 1066 took a gamble, but with that gamble, William changed the course of history.
William the Conqueror is remembered for his conquering of England. Many of his successors wish they could have done the same. Philip II of France, Napoleon, or Hitler. He's the only one who successfully crossed the Channel, ruled England for a long period of time, and laid down his laws to the British.
William's daring invasion and strict rule wiped out many of the divisions among the English people. Instead of being loyal to a local lord, they were loyal to one king who had total control of the land. His sons William II and Henry I would continue the royal line and begin a tradition of monarchs that England still has today. William the Bastard overcame incredible odds to become the most powerful man in 11th century Europe. And with the help of a little propaganda, is known today as William the Conqueror, the first king of England. I'm Captain Dale Dye. Thanks for watching Conquerors.